Well, thank you very much for asking me to speak at this year's school. I still have the second half of that ticket to go back to Cork, by the way. It's a great pleasure to be here. I agree with almost everything that Peter Bacon said. I agree with some of what Rowena said, and I disagree with some of what she said. I think I was about to agree with something that Carl Whelan was about to say. Let me share with you this morning a qualification, a caution, some reflections on what went wrong, some small ideas about what to do about it. The qualification, if you like, is with the assumption underlying this morning's topic that everything has gone wrong. And I think that that's where Carl was getting to when the emergency arose. The path out of our present travail seemed to me to start not just with identifying what went wrong, but with seeing what didn't go wrong. And of course a lot of things have gone awry. Dramatic contraction in economic activity and employment in this country, startling deterioration in government finances, sharp drop in property prices. Internationally, a year and a half ago there were 5 large independent investment banks. Today there are none. But for all of that, not everything has gone wrong. And as Carl was saying, some of the comparisons with the 80s are a bit far-fetched. Government debt as a percentage of GDP was, I think as Rowena said, 112% in 84, now heading perhaps on Peter's table for maybe 50% by the end of next year. And while unemployment was 15.5% in 84 and heading there, or perhaps a bit more now, Carl was about to make the point, I think, that in 1984 there were 1.1 million people in the workforce, and in 2007 there were 2.1 million people in the workforce. And that's a very significant difference. Inflation was 10.4% in 1983. Last August it was about 4%, and now it's heading for minus 5%. The achievements of the last 15 years, which we should not forget, include at least the following: major employment creation, including increased female participation. Rowena drew attention to that. And that's even if you exclude construction. Significant improvement in infrastructure, genuine improvement in infrastructure, especially in the roads. Advances in education, including significant advances in third-level participation rates. When I was teaching in UCC in the 70s, there were 3,500 students. Now there are 17,000. When I was a student in UCD in the 60s, participation rates were 11% in third level. Now they're over 50%. And at a higher level, more global level, get up into the helicopter and look at the whole world, I was struck by something that Michael McLuhan said last night. That if you take all the inhabitants of the planet, we're still doing pretty well. 7 billion people on the earth, 1 billion well off, 5 billion poor, and 1 billion starving. And everyone in this hall and everyone in this country is in the 1 billion that are well off and likely to so remain. And the 12 million children who are going to die between today and this day next year of avoidable childhood diseases, none of them will be in this country. Or the 100 million children who don't go to any school, none of them are in this country. So we just need to keep a perspective on it. The caution that I want to enter is this. I want to enter a caution against the idea that we have yet developed a fully reliable understanding of the economic processes at work since 2007. Clive James, the Australian literary critic, Australian boozer, Australian television critic, call him what you like, he observes that there's an intellectual conceit, and he wasn't talking about economics. There's an intellectual conceit that if you search through all the pieces of the jigsaw in a complex problem, a sufficiently brilliant person will inevitably find the single key bit that joins the whole of the jigsaw together and explains everything. And that's not true. I think it's at least possible that some of our financial systems have become just too complex to understand and were operated by people who didn't understand them. And I'm not sure that we still have an agreed understanding of what's going on. Look at the speed and scale of the downward revision of economic forecasts in 2008 and 2009. Not just talking about the Department of Finance with its monthly contraction in terms of what the contraction would be. But there are other examples of this, and this is where I perhaps part company from Rowena. She draws attention, of course, to some predictors of our woes. The Economist said that the property bubble would collapse in 2004, 2005, 2006. One of the reasons it continued into 2007 is that The Economist was proved wrong for 3 years in a row. I mean, ultimately they were right, but irrational exuberance and bubbles, it's not always irrational to join a bubble. It's irrational, of course, to stay in the bubble. But it's not always irrational not to join in what's going on. And, you know, there was a failure of forecasting. I don't agree with Rowena that it was all signalled. If you look at the OECD report on Ireland, published in April 2008, one of the most respected financial forecasters in the world, it contained the following statement: Irish banks are profitable and well capitalised and provide a buffer against a future downturn. That wasn't a reliable prediction. Martin Wolf, described as the world's most respected financial columnist, thought in June 2007 that the possibility of huge calamities being generated by the world's financial markets was remote, and 3 months later he had changed his tune. When I was learning and then tutoring in economics in UCD in the 60s, Keynes was supreme, and then the Chicago school launched a sort of counterattack with, you know, mathematical models of adaptive expectations and efficient financial market theory and so on. All of them complicated, all of them attracting Nobel Prizes, and still the war goes on. Most graphically and entertainingly, perhaps, between Paul Krugman and Niall Ferguson. So there is less certainty than you would think about what was to happen. The ECB raised interest rates in this month last year to a 4-year high, 5-year high of 4.5%, 4.25%. And there is I mean, you look at the Paul Sweeney book that Carol drew attention to. And remember, there were economic forecasts that this thing would go on forever from economists. So I remember a document called 2020 Vision and a book called It Can Only Get Better. So it's not correct to say, that everyone said, as everyone was warning. That's just not true. And I'm sort of tempted to say, but, well, maybe I'll just whisper that, you know, if you, in 3 weeks' time when Puck Fair is on, you go to the fortune tellers, and if you visit 100 times, you know, some of the predictions will be right. Now, that's a rather superficial thing to say, but it's wrong to say that there was unanimity about all of this. Take, for instance, one of the things that did go wrong. One of the things that did go wrong was there was a view that the dispersion of risk through credit intermediation meant that the whole banking system was more resilient, safer, that there would be much less chance of banks failing in a downturn. This was a view propagated by the IMF in its Financial Stability Report 2006. It said, we're all going to be safer. Fewer banks will fail. Completely wrong. So I just enter a caution about predictability in human affairs. I was at a hurling match in Thurles on Saturday night, and I met a fella that I had done a case for maybe 30 years ago. I think it involved something like the revenue taking a narrow-minded attitude to importing a digger from Northern Ireland or something like that. But he was having a pint in a pub, and it wasn't his first pint, you could tell. But when he saw me, he thought it was appropriate to offer an observation on the economic situation. And he lifted the pint and he said, "You're after recession," he says. It wasn't F, he said, either. "You're after recession," he said. "Sure, 'tis only all one big session anyway." Now, rather sort of Beckettian, cryptic remark. But it signified the public uncertainty about just where are we, and is there a way out of this? So, what did go wrong? And Rowena and before that Peter have demonstrated a number of things that went wrong. And as a former chairman of AIB, the first thing for me to say in plain and unvarnished language is that some serious mistakes were made in Irish banking. And there's absolutely no getting away from that. It's perhaps especially galling that the Irish banks, by and large, avoided the mistakes that wrought havoc in the balance sheets of American and British and continental European banks, where collateralized debt obligations did most of the damage. But we made mistakes of our own, as we well know, particularly in property. Let me quickly go through some of the international causes. And here I'm, speaking very much as an amateur in the presence of professionals who have a better understanding of this. Global financial imbalances. And this, as a driver of the crisis, has been well identified by Paul Volcker's group in the United States, Jacques de la Rosierre's group in Europe, and Adair Turner in the UK. Large current account surpluses in the oil exporting countries and East Asian economies, deficits, huge deficits in the US, and all of this driving rapid credit expansion, credit standards being degraded, the masking of the degradation of credit standards by the property boom, and so on. Second cause, the one I've referred to, the mistaken view on risk dispersion, endorsed by many economists and certainly endorsed by the IMF, a view that transpired simply not to be right. Thirdly, the failure of risk models. Patrick Onahan has written about this. Banks and financial regulators employed complicated mathematical and statistical tools of risk management, building very complex transactions with great confidence. And arguably it was the excessive confidence reposed in those intellectually sophisticated instruments that turned them into, in Professor Honahan's words, a sort of Trojan horse, destroying the system from the inside. And it's well known by now that Union Bank of Switzerland, UBS, got the award for the best risk management house in the world in 2005, and in 2006 its risk managers dealing with risky US contracts managed to lose $44 billion. So there were huge failures in banking and in the private sector. But there were also, I think, failures in regulation. And let me just pick a couple of examples of those. New IFRS accounting rules introduced in 2002 to address some of the problems that had surfaced in the dot-com bubble. They made it more difficult for banks to reserve in good times against the losses they would incur in bad times. Probably increased the transparency of balance sheets a bit. That was the justification. But undoubtedly made banks much more vulnerable to a cyclical downturn. There's an interesting public policy sidebar to this. There were 27 banking regulators in Europe, and 26 of them did what they were told, took on the new IFRS accounting rules and said, this is what you have to do. And one banking regulator stood out against them and said, no, banks should still reserve in good times against bad. And they were threatened with enforcement proceedings by the European Commission. And their own banks didn't like it. That was the Spanish regulator. Never implemented it, resisted it, and was proven right. The second way in which new accounting standards, I think, reinforced the downturn is the insistence on what's called mark-to-market accounting, which is perfectly good when there is a market. And if, the price of milk or the price of cattle is in the paper every day and the fairs or marts are working, it's fine to go into your field and mark the bullocks to market. That's no bother at all. But if no one buys meat anymore, if there was some sort of food scare that meant that no one could sell any bullocks or heifers, how would you mark your cattle to market? In the domestic housing market, the theory is like this. You put a for sale sign outside your house. After a month, you get no offer. You mark it down to zero. And if you've a standard mortgage, you presumably declare yourself a bankrupt the next day. And that's the effect that mark-to-market accounting had in relation to certain financial products. There was also the failure to regulate rating agencies. I'm not going to go into that. But just remember, the rating agencies rated 12 institutions worldwide as AAA. Rabo was probably the only one with a business in this country. And they rated 64,000 collateralized debt instruments as AAA. And that tells its own story. And then central banks didn't do particularly well. I mentioned interest rates, but this is not the place to discuss how central banks did. The Financial Times did a review of the causes of the crash in February of this year and reached a conclusion which I think is about right. It said central banks everywhere issued ritual warnings in the middle of optimistic forecasts. And I think that probably about sums it up. And then, of course, there was the closing of the money markets last September. And then there are the local causes, and Peter has explained these, and Rowena has explained them, and I'm sure Carol will explain them much more eloquently than I can. Public spending expanding too much on the back of unsustainable tax systems. Property taxes, capital gains, stamp duty and VAT were 8.4% of revenue in 2002, and 4 years later they were 18% of all the revenue. And think of the tax reliefs that drove the construction boom. The list is long. There was relief for private hospitals, nursing homes, convalescent homes, mental health centres, palliative care units, sports injury clinics, hotels, holiday camps, holiday cottages, guest houses, third level accommodation, childcare facilities, park and ride facilities, multi-storey car parks. And that's all before you got to the area-based property tax incentives. Urban renewal, town renewal, rural renewal, seaside resorts, the Mid-Shannon scheme, and living over the shop. If you were some sort of an ideologue who never wanted to touch any of these things, I don't know where you'd have lived in the country at all. Everywhere had, these reliefs were ubiquitous, and they were overdone, obviously. Thirdly, public expenditure grew rapidly. In the 10 years to 2008, the population increased, I think, about 10%. And public sector numbers, if you leave out the commercial semi-states but include the health services, increased by 30%, from about 230,000 to about 330,000. As some of the earlier speakers have said, monopoly power wasn't challenged enough in the professions, competition in professional services, the GP's contract, the price of electricity, the excesses of social partnership played a role, and so did the benchmarking exercise. So when you're looking, I don't like the idea of blame, but when you're looking for the causes, it's hard to exempt ourselves, the public. I speak not now in my capacity as a former chairman of a bank, but the public played a role as well. Many of us participated in the property bubble, even if it was only to give one of our children a leg up onto the start of the property ladder. And many people in modest occupations became sort of amateur landlords with consequences to themselves as well. As a nation, I suppose you could say, we abetted a number of falsehoods, believed in things that weren't actually true. There was too much optimism, not enough scepticism, too much borrowing and not enough saving. And there is a sense that national pride and confidence boiled itself up into overconfidence and a sort of national hubris. The feel-good factor was allowed to outweigh rationality. And then we rejected Lisbon. And it seems to me that the very public rejection of Lisbon by a number of media personalities, public commentators, in some instances was evidence itself of the sort of hubris and pride to which the nation had in some way fallen victim, and I think that's a mistake that must not be repeated in October. And then there were the banks. Irish banks made mistakes, and some of them were big ones. While I was chairman of a bank, I made it clear that there were loans that we had made which should not have been made. They weren't made casually. All those loans were backed by detailed analysis, cash flow statements, analysis by chartered accountants and chartered surveyors and statisticians and maths PhDs. But they were wrong. Risk models proved unreliable simply because they hadn't enough risk injected into them. The assumption that there might be a 1 in 20 year downturn, which seemed enormously improbable in, say, 2006, just wasn't enough. Wasn't enough to cope with whatever we're going through at the moment, a 1 in 50 year, maybe a 1 in 100 year downturn. And the impact of a synchronized worldwide contraction was simply not given sufficient weight. And then you have this irrational exuberance to which I've made reference. You know, it's a feature of human herds, and I guess this is something Rowena could talk to us more about as a behavioural economist. And people who think of themselves as sophisticated as to their education or financial knowledge aren't immune from this exuberance. You know, it's been observed that when things are going well in all sorts of areas of life, there's a tendency not to change. It's going well in the family, going well in a sporting club. Don't change the team, you know. Going well in business, going well in all sorts of ways. There's a tendency not to change. It's been said repeatedly, banks are the nervous system of the economy. The feedback loops through which banks interact with the economy make it very hard, I think, for them to be immune from exuberance when it's widespread in the community. It may indeed be commercially impossible for them to do that. If the bank next door is giving out very cheap loans, you may have to try and come close or else go out of business. I get asked about Anglo-Irish Bank. Let me say a couple of things about that. Firstly, it's important to observe that sophisticated international financial consultants, or certainly people who would think of themselves as sophisticated, an international firm who specialise in advising on risk management in banking, we're still recommending Anglo as a model for other banks to follow and emulate in 2007. One of the world's leading investment banks still proposed Anglo as a conviction buy, a really hot share tip for the future, and did so as late as the 30th of September 2008, last September. All the Irish stockbrokers, most Irish financial journalists joined in the praise. It was the best financial stock in Europe and at one stage rated as the best performing bank in the world. And when I was chairman of another bank, I often had investors or shareholders or customers saying, why can't you be more like Anglo? And the House policy was to resist it. And that was the correct policy. But you have to think that inevitably, imperceptibly, consciously or unconsciously, the presence of a competitor who appears to be striding ahead of you, certainly is taking customers from you, certainly is gaining market share, is being lauded and applauded, not just by its own promoters, although they did a reasonable job, but also by analysts and merchant banks worldwide, that does have some effect. Now, let me emphasise this point because it's important. The point I've just made affords no excuse whatsoever for anyone who followed a bad example. No excuse whatsoever. But it just may form a small part of an explanation. Another failure of the banks and the regulators was to appreciate the overdependence on foreign borrowing without appreciating its vulnerability. That was a mistake made in every country in the developed world. And remuneration became excessive, especially executive remuneration, although personally I have to say that I don't think it had a direct causative effect on producing the bubble. I don't believe that part of the commonly accepted view. Now, on banking, obviously, I was more than an interested spectator, and I'm still subject to regulation. So it's not my views on regulation that matter, but Patrick Honohan, colleague of Carl's and Marina's, teaches now in Trinity, has great experience and I think is a respected commentator, and I see that he's coming to speak to you and he will give you real insights into this. He's written in the Economic and Social Review this summer, and he says bank regulation has self-evidently failed. He observed that by 2006, a third of first-time buyers were getting 100% loans, more from some banks than others. He says a very simple warning sign used by most regulators to identify a bank exposed to risk is rapid balance sheet growth, and that 20% annual growth is sometimes taken as the trigger, and that each of the locally owned Irish banks exceeded that trigger in 1 year over the decade. Anglo crossed it in 8 out of 9 years and had an average growth rate of 36%, and Irish nationwide in 6 out of 9 years. And he characterised that signal as an obvious danger sign, not only for those banks, but because of the potentially destabilising effect of reckless competition on the entire sector. So what might have an alert regulator in Dame Street have seen if they looked out the window? They'd have seen widespread praise for Anglo-Irish Bank from investment banks, stockbrokers and so on. But perhaps they should also have seen the elements of a housing bubble, low interest rates, the so-called euro effect, huge credit growth, perhaps excessive concentration in credit portfolios, growth in mortgages of 100% mortgages, and with their access to the internal records of all the banks, perhaps they should have seen long before Patrick Honohan did the matters that he now draws to our attention. So, and all of that said, let me say that any of us who worked in banking or had any involvement with banking in those years will ever and forever after ask ourselves, how did we get it wrong? How did it not appear to us then as it appears to us now? And I've tried to explain some of that, but there are still parts of it that obviously we continue to puzzle even ourselves. Now, as to what needs to be done, Peter Bacon, I think, has given the central message. Don Thornhill says competitiveness is central, and it is. Colin McCarthy has done the country a service, I think, last week. The signposts on the road to recovery are well known. Broaden the tax base, cut out the reliefs, property taxes that are less dependent on transactions, perhaps more user charges, road tolls, water charges, university fees, and the cost of the public service being brought into line with the costs in the rest of the economy. Electricity prices need to fall, and public sector reform, for which Colin McCarthy has given the agenda with dozens of good examples. And lots of things that seem to be a very good idea cost us a lot of money and gave us very little benefit. Let me pick an example. Lots of money was spent at reducing student-teacher ratios in schools, and everyone thought that was a good thing. But there was insufficient attention to the fact that there's a very weak relationship between pupil-teacher ratios and student outcomes. And anyone who was ever in school, and everyone here was in school, will remember and understand that what decides student outcomes is good teachers. And all of us will have had good teachers and bad teachers. And if the good teacher had an extra 6 fellas thrown into the back of the class, he'd still be a good teacher, and you're still well worthwhile going to that class. And if the bad teacher had half the children taken out, he'd still be a bad teacher. So we have dazzled ourselves with this falsehood. I'm going to skip on remedies for the banking system. Prudential regulation needs to be looked at. I think NAMA, which Peter stayed away from, is going to be a good solution if the details are worked out correctly. I think it has the prospect of reducing Irish banks' reliance on potentially unstable international money markets and facilitating the provision of normal banking. One of the things that reassures me about NAMA, and I don't see it much commented on, is a legal point. There's a little known judgment that says that the Irish Constitution requires semi-state bodies, even commercial semi-state bodies, always to behave in a way that's fair and reasonable. Now, those rules don't apply to private sector commercial bodies, but it will apply to NAMA. And if you see the controversy about the valuation issues for NAMA, it's a complicated question. One of the things that I bear in mind is that there's a constitutional imperative for that exercise to be done in a way that's fair and reasonable. Remember those words, and I think they provide a lot of assurance that an excellent chance exists of NAMA serving its public policy purpose and avoiding unnecessary challenges. Let me conclude now. Notwithstanding the formidable challenges outlined by my colleagues, I retain a confidence about the future. We're in much better position to deal with these issues than we were in the 80s. But the bottom line in my book is this, that the real challenge is for the government and for the people. For the government, will the people be able to make and implement the difficult policy choices that have to be made, and I think Peter was hinting at this, in a context where all politicians are obliged to compete for attention in a noisy market where sound bites prevail over complex or painstaking analysis. That's the problem for the government. And even more to the point, will we the people, to borrow a line out of the Constitution of Ireland, will we the people accept what needs to be done in order to achieve a sustainable future for our children? Now, I asked a friend to look over the notes for this speech a couple of days ago, and he said there's very little light-hearted about it. And I said it's not a very light-hearted topic. So as a concession to the criticism I received, let me tell you something not about this topic, but something about yourselves. About 6 or 7 years ago, a distinguished English university, the Applied Psychology of its Department of Distinguished English University, looked at captive audiences. and you're a captive audience, and I suppose you could escape if you really want to, but it's hard for you all to walk out no matter how much you hate what I'm saying. But looked into how captive audiences behave. Do they really pay any attention at all? And the conclusion in broad brush terms was that about 2/3 of the people actually listen to what's being said, which seemed very high figure to me. And then of the rest, about 15% just go to sleep with their eyes open, which is a reasonable solution, I would say, as well. And the final 15% diverted themselves with fantasies. And the fantasies were almost exclusively concerned with matters of sexual interest. Bearing that in mind, let me hope that I haven't disturbed any of you who are sleeping. Thank those of you who paid attention, and I hope the rest of you are having a pleasant morning as well. Thanks very much.